Hi, in this video we're going to be looking at a brief introduction to databases, although we're not actually going to use a database in this video. That'll come at a later point. We're going to start off by looking at a brief definition of what a database is, then we're going to look at why we use databases, and then looking at a range of some of the database systems that are available to you today. So first of all, we'll start off with what is a database. And databases are somewhere you can store you've got information or data in a structured way. And you can have databases which are either electronic, which are what the majority of them are currently, or you can have databases that are made up of paper tables. You look at filing cabinets. I mean, they are basically the precursor to what we have now, where you'd have everything stored by probably name, letter, and then you'd have things within the actual filing cabinet that you would try to find. Or you can change for the situation that you may be encountering at that time. So databases are very common in businesses because ultimately, pretty much no matter what you're doing, if you have an IT system, you're going to have a database of some kind. Because if you think about if you're running a shop, then you're going to want a database of multiple different things, really. You're going to want a database of your customers, you're going to want a database of orders, you're going to want suppliers, you're going to want probably your employees, you're going to want a database of your sales, and so on and so on. And what you try and do long term is ultimately have a database which stores everything you need within your company. So you might have one database that stores all of that information, but at the same time you may have multiple different databases. Some people use the term databases and spreadsheets kind of interchangeably. I mean, they do quite similar things in some respects, but ultimately you always need to remember that databases is more for data and things like text and storing large amounts of stuff, whatever it might be, whereas spreadsheets are more designed for numeric reasons and use things like formulae within it. So you could do things like addition of certain sums within the spreadsheet, and you can do multiple different things like developing graphs and so on, whereas databases are more designed to be things like you can input data within it, you can process things called queries that we will look at a later date. I mean, basically what you're saying is you have a set of data and your query is where you look for a certain thing. I mean, it's basically a search, and if you think of in the past, it would be a case that you'd have to go through however many different records you'd have to find, I don't know, how many of your customers have spent £100 with you in the past, whereas these days you can run a query and it will find it within quite a short space of time. Databases, along with spreadsheets, actually are commonly covered in UK schools during GCSEs within the ICT course, although the ICT course has been disbanded in the next year or two. And it was relatively useful at the time it was made, but these days it probably isn't quite so useful as the length of time that they spent covering databases was too long, really, in my opinion. Whereas they should have been getting on to do things like programming and web dev or networking, the actual things which are used within the industry these days. I mean, don't get me wrong, you need to know about databases. Really, really important to know about databases because that's where all your stuff is stored. But actually, while a database administrator may get paid reasonably well, long term within the IT industry, you're going to want to be doing something else, really. Okay, so databases you may or may not have come across before. Databases can have one or more linked tables. So if you have one or more linked tables, it becomes a relational database because the tables should be related to each other. So in other words, you'll have common things within each table, which may be something like order ID or whatever it might be. And within those tables are a number of fields. So if you think of your table, the fields are basically each part of the table. So if you have a table which is about employees, then your fields could be name, it could be position, it could be how much they earn, it could be where they live. Okay, and the fields could be any range of different data types, and you're going to have to get used to slightly different words that you may have come across previously, such as text, integer, which basically is number, but whole number, boolean, which is yes or no, or dates. So remember, boolean is where you have either a yes or no answer. There is no grey area there. Now what you can't do is perform formula like you do within a spreadsheet. So you can't go and concatenate lots of different data, or you can't perform you might be able to concatenate when you actually run the query, but ultimately what you can't do is say, for example, add all the stuff together. That's you'd need some quite complex language behind your database in order to do that. But ultimately, you wouldn't look to do it in a database. Your database, you could potentially export it to a spreadsheet and then you can perform your calculations on it, but it's not something that you would necessarily do. However, like I said, you could run things like queries. So if you're doing, like I said, a query on your customers, you could say how many of my customers were born after 1990, and then you would get a result for that, and then you would have a rough idea of the general age range of your customers, for example. So databases are written in a language called Structured Query Language, SQL. Actually, SQL sounds much more complex than what it is. SQL is quite a straightforward language compared with some of them. And one of the advantages of it is that it pretty much does what it says on the tin. Now, we're not going to touch SQL within this PowerPoint. And it's not really a level 3 topic, to be honest, but I would recommend you have a little look at it, because this is very, very straightforward, especially if you go on and use things like MySQL. You will need to use basic SQL, but it's honest, compared with a lot of other languages out there, SQL is very straightforward. Right, so very quickly we'll have a look at some of the database advantages. So databases can store and hold large numbers of data, and when you process this data, so you could perform a query on it or you could perform a report, you'll then get information of the data. So data by itself doesn't mean anything. You need to actually process it. So you'll need to turn it into something which is relatively useful. So you can say, you have all these customers, and then you perform a query and you say, right, out of my 10,000 customers, how many of them bought whatever? Okay, and then you get some information out of it. Processing time is a fraction of what it would be of a human. You're talking milliseconds as opposed to the human. ultimately, so if you're running a query, it will generally give you a result very quickly. Whereas if you are a human, you're going to have to thumb through all of your results to finally get there, which could take you hours, and days, years sometimes, I guess, to get some kind of result from it. And it might not be right, whereas the database will always be right. The only time it wouldn't be right is if you have put the wrong inputs in yourself. So that would be a human error, and is not the error of database. So if you're running a query and the query results are wrong, it's because the query that has been processed in the first place is not right, which is, like I said, a human error. You can get a large number of queries or forms. So the forms can be created using a GUI. GUI stands for Graphical User Interface, the GUI, Graphical User Interface. And one of the nice things about that is you can actually create a really nice form which will allow users to input data into whatever you want to do. So a form can be a data entry form, where you can put data into a table, or your form could also run a query where you could put a search into your form and then it would run a query. So the idea behind the form is that it's basically a graphical user interface for somebody to use, and it will be quite useful, because if you've ever seen a database table, it is quite a bland thing, and it could potentially have thousands of rows, thousands of entries in there, and it can be quite daunting. So to have a nice graphical user interface makes it nicer for an end user, because you have to remember that ultimately the people that use the database are probably not going to be the people that design the database. People that actually use it tend to be, they need something that frankly is as easy as possible. Compatible with other software, so databases tend to be linked with all sorts of different things. So in this example, I've got web pages and computer games, but it could be pretty much anything. Like I said, it could be stock inventory, it could be customers, it could be, and then you link it with other things. So like I said, I'll get the word out in the end. If you're linking it to a till, you might link it to a transaction processing system, so that when you're running it through, it will work out how much money it needs to take and where from. It will need to work out stock can come out of your inventory and so on. And maybe if it's like a performance-based system, you could be working out who sold the item, which would be a useful thing, because there are some stores such as the ones like there's a lot of white goods like PC World or Currys and so on, that have a performance related pay system, or at least they did a little while back. I don't know if they still do. So some disadvantages about databases. Obviously complexity is going to be one of them. These things are not simple to set up and run. Okay, it's not like you can get a random off the street and just set up a database. Okay, whereas there are some programs like your Photoshops and your graphic design packages whereby you can have a go at the beginning and it's not going to have too much of an issue if you don't quite, you can run with whatever you have, and you can give things a try, and it's not necessarily going to go wrong if you make a mistake. But with databases, it can go wrong quite quickly. So it is a complex thing. GIGO stands for garbage in, garbage out. What it basically means is that if your database is collecting data and that data is not accurate and it's not right, then whatever your database does from that point on, it's not going to produce anything worthwhile. Okay, so your data that you're taking in at the beginning needs to be accurate. Therefore, the way that your database is set up, it needs to have the right data types, it needs to be linked up properly. Excuse me. It needs to be valid. Okay, so you need to make sure that you're not putting people into your database that are 200 years old. It's a really important thing to make sure that when your database is set up that it is optimal and that it is collecting everything that you need it to, and that's where, when you're planning it at the very beginning, set it up right, because otherwise you're going to spend all this time doing it and it's not really going to be worth anything. Okay, security requirements. Obviously, if you have customer details, employee details, etc., you're going to need quite a lot of security on that database, or probably on your system as a whole. See, there are lots of new regulations out at the minute, and they're not going to change. It's only going to become more complex in order to secure your data, and that means you're going to need to find a way to secure it, which, some people will go, oh, we have a firewall and we have this, that, and the other. And it's like, well, that's great, but actually you probably need a bit more these days. And just one of those off-the-shelf security packages isn't going to cut it. You're going to need to be hiring in people and putting some actual bespoke, so in other words, unique to you, security onto your system that makes it really difficult for people to get in. Cost is obviously going to be a big one. So some databases require significant amount of upfront funding. So in a slide or two, we're going to look at one, for example, called Oracle. Oracle is a very popular database among big businesses, and the most expensive Oracle package comes in at £35,000. So, this thing is not cheap. But on the flip side, there are some databases that are free. So, but they're not really suitable for bigger companies. They're more kind of for smaller standalone companies. And of course, compatibility. So while we got some databases that could be compatible with some software, it's not compatible with all software, and that means that you may run into issues further down the line. So some databases are designed to work with certain packages. For example, Access is designed to work with other Microsoft products. It's not designed to work with MySQL, or is not designed to work with PHP. So I'll get the word out in the end. That might become an issue. And it's something to bear in mind, because these things are not easy to fix. Okay, so moving on quickly, got some database types. I'm not going to go over each one of these. I'm going to go over Access, MySQL, and Oracle. You're more than welcome to have a look at the other two, but I've already been talking for 15 minutes, so ultimately, once you see the types of things that I'm talking about with this stuff, you'll be able to potentially take and apply it to the other ones. DBase is one that I'm not going to talk about. Is actually the oldest database type, but isn't that frequently used, which is why I've left it out of this list. First one I'm going to talk about is Access. Probably the most common one, especially among smaller businesses, because it's obviously part of the Microsoft package, so therefore it's kind of there. And quite easy to well, I say easy, it's one of the easier ones to set up. Now, Access was released in 1992. That makes it one of the younger ones. You would be surprised. But you've got a nice graphical user interface with an Access to make it look nice and easy for an end user. You don't have to learn any SQL. To actually kind of make it work, although it is useful, it's always going to be useful, and you can import linked to data stored elsewhere. Now, Access does have support by Visual Basic applications, which is the same as all Microsoft products, so you can add programming elements to the databases. It's not really that well used, to be honest. I mean, if you're going to look at really kind of developing that sort of thing, you probably wouldn't use Access, to be brutally honest with you. But I said you have that option. It's there. I know that within spreadsheets, I've used the Visual Basic to, for example, run splash screens and printouts and various different things. So I presume you can probably do the same thing with Access. I haven't actually used it for that purpose myself. So some advantages, disadvantages. Advantages: easy to use, widely popular. So easy to use in terms of it comes with the Office suite, so therefore it tends to just be installed with the rest of it. Widely popular in terms of lots of people use it, probably because it comes with the Office suite and is pretty easy to use. I mean, that's really why Microsoft is as popular as it is, because it's so easy to use. You've got cost effectiveness. It doesn't seem to be cost effective if you think about it. You pay £100 maybe for the Office suite, but actually, like I said, that is dwarfed by things like Oracle and even SQL Server, even though we're not going to talk about SQL Server. Multi-user support, so it, I believe, has support for up to a couple of hundred people using it at once, although actually it tends to fall down a bit after you get to about 80 people using, which is still a few people, but it is something to bear in mind. Disadvantages: so once you get up to very large amounts of data, Access will start to fall over a little bit, which is why you tend to not have it being used in the big businesses. It tends to be used in the smaller businesses, and all the database is stored in the one file, which means that you're actually quite limited with what you can do with it, because everything is kind of self-contained, as opposed to being able to manipulate various different parts of a database to actually do what you want it to do. MySQL, I should have said Microsoft Access is a database management system, DBMS, whereas MySQL is a relational database management system. So in other words, you are going to have lots of things that are linking together in MySQL, more so than you would maybe in Access. MySQL is a central component of AMP. So AMP stands for Apache, MySQL, PHP, Python, and Perl, although I haven't written Perl on there. So basically what you have here is your operating system. You have Apache, which is your web server. You have MySQL, which is your database, and you have a programming language behind it, which in this instance is your Python or your PHP. PHP is a web server script. So what you can have here is Windows is, like I said, the operating system, and what you're looking to do is develop a website that could potentially have a database in behind it, and you need a language to link Apache, MySQL, and your website together, which will be your PHP, but you don't necessarily need to know too much about the components of and theories of that, because ultimately you're doing a database unit, you're not doing a web dev unit. And even if you were doing a web dev unit, you probably wouldn't do this at level 3. MySQL, all that's free, by the way. WAMP and LAMP, and so WAMP is Windows, LAMP is Linux. All that's free, and it's open source. So that means anybody can go in and change it and add functionality to it, which is great. MySQL is used by many high-profile sites such as Google. You've also got content management systems such as WordPress and Joomla that can be used with it, which is quite useful. WordPress is very, very popular. If you're vaguely interested in getting into websites, I would recommend having a look at WordPress, because again, it's free, and the functionality and the ability to actually develop websites very, very easily and professionally is very useful. Advantages of MySQL. So that's it, open source, and that means anybody can go in there and add changes to it and add add-ons and various different things. It is reasonably easy to use. I mean, I would add a caveat to that, in that if you don't know the SQL language, it isn't easy to use, but SQL itself is very easy, to be honest, compared with some of the other languages. It's cheap, well, it's free. So of course it's going to be cheap. However, you do need to bear in mind all the additional cost that's going to go on top of that. Ultimately, you're going to need all the software in order to support this. Okay. Industry standard, MySQL is used by, I don't know an exact figure, but it's used by an awful lot of companies out there, especially in these days of things like austerity and so on. It's a very big package. Support available. I mean, you've got a whole community out there, and it's one of the advantages of being open source is it has, it's not controlled by people sat in development rooms in an office in wherever it might be. These people are ordinary people like you and I, and there's hundreds and thousands of them. And if you go onto the forums, because there'll be lots of forums out there, there will be lots of people out there who might be able to help you. Okay. Disadvantages, stability issues. So what you'll find is that with certain things, particularly functions, it doesn't handle it as well as things like Oracle, so things like references and transactions. It doesn't do quite so well, but it generally works okay. Performance scaling. So similar to Access, the more people you have using this thing, the longer it's going to take, basically. It's still usable, but it's not as good as what it once was. I mean, to be brutally honest, you'll find that with pretty much any IT software. The more people you have using it, the slower it's going to be. For obvious reasons, really. The more people you have playing away at a certain resource, the longer things are going to take. It is the way of things. Functionality is dependent on the add-ons, so the actual vanilla SQL and MySQL out the I was going to say out the box, but of course you download it, is reasonably bare, and you will need to download some add-ons from various different places, which can be semi-complex to actually work out. And of course you've got limitations that can be frustrating. So as with anything, if your program doesn't do quite what you want it to do, it can be irritating. And because MySQL is such I can't think of the exact word right now, but basically when you download it, it's very, very kind of, it hasn't got the GUI of an Access, it hasn't got the in-program help functions of an Access. I know, so the support is available online, but it's not right there and then, which can frustrate people. it is quite a bland experience, I suppose you could say. But I said it's very, very well used, and it's a good thing to kind of get your head around and get used to using. You got Oracle, finally, by far the one that is best at handling larger databases. So what they would do is Oracle tends to be used with things like transaction cloud-based programs such as Java. Java can be used with applications on the web, and you can go and read it up if you want, but ultimately we're concentrating in this video on Oracle. Again, it is an RDBMS, a relational database management system, but you have to remember that ultimately Oracle is really good for larger databases, and by that we're talking many hundreds of gigabits in size. So you might have one of the larger high street stores, for example, will use Oracle to hold all their stuff. And you got your disadvantage. So you got your advantages here. So your reliability and functionality. You expect this thing and does run properly all the time. Flashback technology basically means that you've got support, but if the program gets updated, or if you make changes, and then basically if you don't want to be losing any of your changes because the actual Oracle software changes, if that makes sense. So that kind of helps with that. It's almost like a backup, I suppose you could say. Performance. But I mean, ultimately, with all of these advantages, you have to kind of weigh the cost against all of them and be like, well, actually, so the most expensive Oracle package comes in at $35,000, and that's very expensive. So if you're paying that amount of money, you would expect all of that. So it's kind of like a swings and roundabouts thing, really. And difficulty with the other programs that I've just mentioned, so with the Access and with the MySQL, they are reasonably straightforward. You install them and then you run with it. However, Oracle is much more complex than that. Oracle is going to be something that takes up a lot of the person who's running its time. And what you've got to also remember is that ultimately, if you're paying $35,000 for a package, you're probably hiring someone to work on it, or a team to work on it all the time. It would be quite a big thing, really. So that's 3 different database technologies that we've covered there. There are some others, so for example, DBase and SQL Server, but I think it's just a case of, some of them will be quite similar to these packages here. SQL Server is more of a commercial package like Oracle. DBase is more for programming and isn't really that well used these days, but it still is out there. But if you look at it from these type of things, ultimately you need to be looking at the advantages and disadvantages for each of them. And if you're running a business, you'll be weighing up these pros and cons, and particularly with things like cost, if you're a startup business, going to be very important. And just working out which one of these is going to be best for you. For a smaller business, something like Access may well fulfill all the needs that you need, but then as you scale up with the number of customers that you have and the security requirements, then it may stop being like that. Well, thank you for watching. I know this isn't the most exciting topic in the world, but ultimately, databases are very, very important with what we do. And so thank you for watching, and I will hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.